No, Scott, you will meet him again and again and again. Not only will you meet him again and again and again, you'll meet him under different circumstances. You'll have the opportunity to say you're sorry for the things that hurt him, because when you die, you will go back and live your life again.
This is an emergency broadcast. This is not a test.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Dad's Doomsday Guide. Before we get started on today's episode, I want to let you know that we launched memberships here on YouTube. By joining, you get early access to episodes, members-only polls, individual shout-outs, and a behind-the-scenes look at what we're working on. Tap join if you'd like to be a part of it. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please give us a quick follow and a rating. It helps a ton. Today's guest is Anthony Peake, an author exploring the edges of human consciousness. He has written several books and is known for Cheating the Ferryman, and most recently, Near-Death Experiences, the science, psychology, and anthropology behind them. Anthony's claim is bold, that our minds and maybe our lives don't work the way we think. In this interview, we get into the framework, the evidence he leans on, and why it resonates with so many people. Enjoy. Welcome, Anthony. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I guess for people who don't know, who you are, could you explain a little bit? I know you've done this a lot. You do a lot of podcasts, a lot of events, and so you're always explaining kind of who you are and what you do. But briefly, could you just kind of describe how you came to be in this position, researching this material, and what your background is?
Yeah, an assumption that I know who I am. Who knows who we are at all times? Sort of deep philosophical question to start a discussion on. Define who you are. Okay, very, very quickly. My name is Anthony Peake. I am a British author, now written 13 books. All traditionally published, not self-published. So the publishers actually pay me and pay me advances to do the books, which sometimes is brilliant, sometimes less good. My books all deal with the fringe areas of the consciousness-reality interface. So my opinions and my work has always been to do with what exactly do we mean when we say we are conscious? What do we mean when we're saying we're perceiving something? I'm also very interested in quantum mechanics implications of this, the neurochemical implications of extraordinary human experiences, such as near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, déjà vu, precognition, these kind of things. By training, university training, I'm a sociologist, a historian and a sociologist, and I've studied statistics and psychology at postgraduate level. First degree I did at Warwick University here in the UK. My postgraduate work was at the London School of Economics in London. Although I do not consider myself an academic, I very much take a very, very academic approach to the subject. So in general terms, that's a very brief background to who I am. Just very, very quickly, I've been interested in fringe phenomenon ever since I was 13 or 14 years of age, and I've been studying the phenomenon since the late 1960s. Because
you mentioned consciousness, and I know that means different things to certain people depending on who you're talking to. And I noticed, from NDEs to alien abductions to paranormal phenomenon, it seems like these are all kind of bundled together sometimes, and they can be, depending on who you speak to, and I've spoken to people in the past recently who believe that they're kind of all in the same thing. Mm-hmm. Can we peel some of these layers back? And I don't know where you find it more valuable to start. Is it consciousness to define that before you get into some of these other things that you discuss?
Yeah, very much. Consciousness itself is the most extraordinary phenomenon, both philosophically and physiologically. Because for me, my argument has been for many, many years, how is it that inanimate matter reacting with electrochemical impulses in my brain creates Anthony, Tony, creates Scott, creates our hopes, our dreams, our loves, our hates. All these things are created by consciousness, but consciousness itself is a non-physical epiphenomenon of brain processes. So in other words, you can open up the brain and you can take it apart to the minutest detail. You can take it down to the molecular level, but you will never, ever find consciousness in there. What you will only ever find is physical matter made up of basically the 6 quarks and various other subatomic particles, but that's it. And these things are in their very basis inanimate. Not only that, but they have no consciousness in their own right. But put them together in a brain, put them together and have them reacting with neurochemicals in the brain, and suddenly, spontaneously from nowhere, a perceiving something that is looking out of your eyes suddenly spontaneously appears. And as I've argued in some of my writing, where does consciousness come from? Is it the addition of one electron? Is it the addition of one quark? Is it the addition of one molecule? Is consciousness based in the brain, or is the brain a receiver of consciousness? And I'm coming to the conclusion over many, many years and spending years of my life studying this subject, and I mean seriously studying it. The conclusion one can only come to is that the brain is a receiver of consciousness, and that consciousness exists out there in some form of field. Because, for instance, there's the general idea of what's called reductionist materialists and eliminative materialists, who argue quite seriously that there is no inner life, that we are fooling ourselves into believing we are conscious, perceiving entities. People like Daniel Dennett and the Churchlands have long argued this. The late, great Daniel Dennett, I admire the guy greatly, but who on earth Daniel Dennett thought was actually spending his royalties, I have absolutely no idea. Or indeed, who was writing his books for him, because he genuinely believed it wasn't him because there was nothing inside his head. Of course, the big question is, if we are being fooled into thinking we are conscious, surely that's a contradiction in terms, because how can anything that's not conscious be fooled? I can't fool a stone into doing anything, but apparently my non-consciousness can. And of course, way back in 1994, a young Australian philosopher called David Chalmers, at an event at the University of Arizona, made a famous speech when he called it the hard problem of science. The soft problem of science is how the brain functions, and the hard problem of consciousness is how the brain creates that consciousness. And of course, it's consciousness that perceives everything. As we know from quantum mechanics, there's a direct relationship between, it seems, the observer and the observed. And subatomic particles are brought into existence by the act of observation by a conscious mind, which means there's a feedback mechanism taking place here. So is there any out there? Is there any reality out there? Because we know that physical reality out there is 99.99999999996 empty space. And what is left in that empty space are just vibrations.
Do you want cased insights and artifacts we're tracking behind the scenes? Grab the Veil Report email and receive this once a month. No spam. And if you're enjoying the podcast, you can support us on Buy Me a Coffee. Links are in the description. I watched another interview and you were talking about that. And then I started going down the rabbit hole because I never was really interested in science when I was a kid because I think it's the way it's taught and presented to you. You don't get into kind of these weird, abstract, philosophical debates about stuff, and to really kind of pique your interest about what exactly is real. And so later in life, I came to appreciate it more. But I was starting to read about all of that stuff, and I was just like, man, just touching the table. I was like, this is so. What am I touching right now? It kind of it was fun to go down that rabbit hole. So for consciousness, and when you. Because I spoke to Bernardo Kastrup a while ago, and that was kind of my first introduction to kind of, metaphysical idealism, or I forget how he brands it exactly. And where consciousness, I think for him, there was no hard problem. It wasn't even an issue because of how he viewed that as the base layer of reality and things coming from that versus Chalmers, I think, having to trying to pull that into the materialist kind of worldview, if I'm not mistaken. Or
yes.
Can you explain a little bit how you think materialists are failing in terms of looking for evidence of that, and how your view and your framework of reality takes care of, I guess, that problem that they seem to be butting up their head against?
I'm very much in agreement with Bernardo in a lot of his work in terms of the idea of the phenomenology of experience and the idea that is there anything out there or not? Or is everything effectively, for want of a better term, perception or thought? And I would like to believe I go slightly further than Bernardo in that my opinion, and it is an opinion, but it is based upon hard research done by other people, not myself, that modern science is missing the point. Because it's so preoccupied in materialist reductionism, which is the argument that, and it's quite a valid argument, you take something apart, and by taking it apart, you will understand how it functions. So, if you have a car engine, an internal combustion engine, you take it apart and you will very quickly realize that it's working on the expansion of gases, and that's what's causing the movement and everything else. So you can do that. But you can't do that with consciousness, and you can't do that with perception. It doesn't work that way. We're talking about very different substances. We're talking about thought, which has no extension in space. It has no rex extens. It doesn't expand in space. It just is somewhere, if indeed it is located anywhere. So science is preoccupied with the idea of breaking the brain apart in order to find consciousness, or breaking anything apart in order to understand how it functions. And it just doesn't work. There is something called promissory materialism, which is the idea that we may not understand how the brain functions and how the brain creates consciousness now, but we will magically in the future. There will be some kind of superb breakthrough, and suddenly we'll all realize that we can prove that the brain creates consciousness. The problem is we can't, because we're looking at the territory rather than the map. The idea that in some way you can reduce something down and suddenly you will get a kind of a quantum particle of consciousness. And suddenly it will be there, and suddenly you can take it apart and you can look at it. But it doesn't work that way. And because modern science is so much in denial of what we would call non-physical reality, it's missing the point, and it's not identifying and discussing issues of perception, the ontological arguments, the arguments of being, what it is to be something, perceiving something, and the idea that in some way consciousness is not real is strange. So what we have to do is we have to start looking at when people tell us that they've had extraordinary experiences, such as near-death experiences, out-of-the-body experiences, precognitions. We should do what science used to do, which is be empirical. And empirical is literally, the word means from experience. And science works in this way, doesn't it? They do experiments and people observe experiments and they repeat the experiment to make sure what their findings are correct and validated. But the issue is it's still a conscious mind doing the validation of that experiment. There's no objective anything happening other than a scientist making a calculated decision as to what this phenomenon is telling him about. And he then shares that phenomenon with other scientists who then observe it collectively and say, yes, this is real because we've tested it. But all we've done really is tested and repeated something in some way. And that's why we have the argument of theory, the idea, the theory of gravity. Gravity is real and it is genuine, but it is a theory because there might be one day it won't work. And that is the central meaning of the word theory. But what we have to do is to say, well, if the whole of the observed world involves and includes consciousness and precognition and out-of-body experiences and people sharing perceptions that are arguably hallucinations in raised commas, we're then in a position that we are looking at the full science and the full picture. Like, for instance, I give a classic example of this. I always love this, is that when a person has an hallucination, it is technically, and it is known by definition, as being something you perceive that nobody else sees or feels or senses or hears. But there are scenarios where more than one person, two people share the same experience. And I've had case after case after that. And I know the plural of anecdote is not proof, but it's beside the point. In other words, scientific research is anecdotal in the sense that all it is lots of scientists agreeing that something happens the way it does. It's still anecdote by definition, So the idea that if two people share an experience, science has an explanation for this. They call it a folie à deux. And they argue that the two people in some way are sharing the experience. And the explanation they use for a folie à deux, and this is fascinating, is if two independent consciousnesses locked inside somebody's head, two different heads, experience the same thing, there has to be a form of communication taking place between those two brains. And that form of communication is what is generally called telepathy. So modern science explains a shared hallucination, something it really doesn't like, with something it also doesn't like, but likes slightly more. So they're actually using something they diss to explain something they diss even more. Then if you have a whole group of people who have a collective hallucination, That's then collective hysteria. But science has never explained how the mechanism of this happens. Many, many years ago, there's this fascinating book written on the mass delusion of crowds. But effectively, again, how does the infection take place between independent consciousnesses? So we've got to dig a little bit deeper, and we've got to say, what is science telling us about the nature of reality? And it's telling us some very interesting things. It seems to be suggesting that science is telling us that subatomic particles communicate at a much deeper level than the physical world. It's something called non-locality, or spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it. You take two subatomic particles, you place them in the same quantum system, then you send them off millions of miles apart, and you do something to the first particle, the other one reacts immediately. And as famous sorry, go on.
I apologize. I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but for the same quantum or atomic system, for non-scientific people or people who haven't read about it, what does that exactly mean when you're talking about that?
Well, it's when what is technically called, you entangle particles. They share the same vibrational state, for want of a better word. How the background to it was, I think it was in 1937, that Albert Einstein had great difficulty with the idea of what was called the classic interpretation of quantum mechanics. There was people like Niels Bohr and everybody else. And the implications of the classic model of quantum mechanics that came up in the 1920s and into the 1930s was there seems to be a direct relationship between the active observation of a consciousness with the creation of subatomic particles. It's called the collapse of the wave function. It's discussed in Schrodinger's Schrodinger's cat is an example of this. And Einstein found it so illogical because he argued, I do not believe that the moon doesn't exist if I don't look at it. But quantum mechanics and the Copenhagen interpretation was very much making out that this was the case. Now, Einstein really wanted to disprove this, and he came up over many of years. There were conferences called the Solvay conferences that took place in Brussels. And every year he'd have arguments with Niels Bohr about the nature of reality. And every year he'd come up with a thought experiment that would try and disprove Bohr and his idea that consciousness, that there's a relationship. And every year Bohr managed to disprove what Einstein said. And in sheer desperation, and I think I say it was 1937, I think, Einstein worked with two other associates, Podolsky and Rosen, to come up with something called the EPR paradox. And basically what they argued was that if you did entangle two subatomic particles and place them millions of miles apart, if you did to one, the other one would react instantaneously. But as Einstein argued, that is impossible because of the speed of light. All communication has a limit as to how fast information can transfer between two objects. And he said that's impossible. But what happened was, in I think 1966, 1967, an Irish physicist at CERN, John Bell, came up with a mathematical model that disproved Einstein. It actually proved that non-locality was mathematically real. Then in 1981/82, I'm never sure of the year because it's always a bit confusing with the papers, three scientists in Paris Institute of Optics, led by a guy called Alain Aspect, actually created two particles that they put into different locations in the laboratory. They did with one, and the other one reacted instantaneously. Since then, it has been proven time and time again under laboratory conditions. And if you don't believe me on this, I'm sure you do, but if anybody out there doesn't believe me on this, check out the work of a guy called Anton Zeilinger, who was at the University of Innsbruck and is now at the University of Vienna. He's been doing this communication, this spooky action at a distance between subatomic particles for years and years and years. It's just that modern science is in such denial of the implications of this, they don't talk about it. They really don't. It should have been headlines around the world when Aspect and Dalibard did their experiment, but it isn't. And it is because it doesn't fit in. Now, I'll make a final point now. Science develops with the white crows, the black swans, the outliers, the things that don't make sense within the present scientific model. Like, for instance, The reason that the scientific paradigm of the Middle Ages, the Aristotelian science, changed was because of the observations of the outer planets and something called retrograde motion didn't work within their geocentric system, that the Earth was the center of the universe. So the heliocentric, and Copernicus came along, and with his heliocentric, the sun was the center of the solar system. And suddenly it solved the problem. But it meant somebody taking a problem that didn't fit in and using that, and the whole scientific structure crumbles. Then Newton comes along with his ideas. And then in the turn of the 18th to 19th century, when Einstein came along and Niels Bohr came along, and Niels Bohr came along and proved something that was absolutely stunning, that energy came in tiny packets. Energy wasn't continual. And he called these tiny packets quanta, which actually means how big or what for or package. And it was in December 1900 that he stood up, Max Planck stood up at the University of Berlin and made this statement that energy comes in chunks. This completely threw Newtonian science in a tiz. And suddenly Newtonian science didn't have all the answers, and suddenly quantum mechanics came out of that. And then in 1905, Einstein has his incredible year where he writes 3 astonishing papers, and suddenly science changed forever. Now, this is because it's the things that don't fit. It's called the theory of scientific revolutions. A guy called Cohn came up with it many, many years ago. And the idea is that all science evolves not gradually, but by revolution. And the revolution is looking at the black swans, and the stuff we are interested in, like out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, DMT experiences, are the areas that is going to give us the pointers to a new science that will revolutionize the way we see the universe.
And so this quantum level that you think science is now just discovering and kind of diving into, and that they're kind of resistant to, points to evidence of people who believe in what, like you do, and what you propose as being consciousness and how it would possibly work or manifest itself in at least our physical reality. Is that an accurate-ish statement?
Basically, yes, it is. And there's more and more people now moving along the lines. And I've been writing about this for 2 decades, and I'm delighted now that other writers are getting hold of this and are running with it. People who are much better qualified than me, younger guys who are coming up and saying, well, actually, there's really, like Riz van Werk, who is a guy that spoke with me at the event in
the simulation gentleman, correct?
Simulation theory.
Yeah, I talked to him. I had him on a while ago.
Oh, Rizvan is a great guy.
He's a really nice guy.
I've been doing this for 20 years. I've been writing about this for 20 years. Way before a lot of these guys came along, and I always acknowledge the people that influenced me. There was a book called The Holographic Universe that came out in the late 1980s. And the guy that wrote that, whose name has just escaped me, it'll come to me in a minute, really was the forerunner of this. But there's been so many other writers writing about this over the years whose work has been sidelined. Jim Elvidge is another person that's been writing about this. Another associate of mine, Dr. Robin Kelly, wrote a book called The Human Hologram about 15, 20 years ago. It's just that now, because we are in a society that can understand the principles of the simulation, that the universe could be a simulation, or what another fellow speaker of mine at the Contact in the Desert, I managed to get him an invite 2 years ago, Dr. Andrew Gallimore calls an instantation. The idea that it is not a simulation, because a simulation implies a copy of, but it's more of an instantation. These guys are now running with it, and Rizvan, with his knowledge of computer systems and his work in Silicon Valley and everything else, he can really pull the bits together and come up with the models that are very, very powerful. So the idea is that in some way, the universe works under holographic principles. And again, the holographic principle has been in vogue now again for around about 30 years. People like Juan Maldacana, Jacob Bekenstein. In fact, there was the front cover of Scientific American about 25 years ago actually had the cover, Are You a Hologram? And Is the Universe a Hologram? So it's been around for a long time. And it's to do with black holes. It's to do with information, how information is processed. because there's more and more people arguing. I mean, again, I get in a run when I do these things. But if you check out the writings of somebody called Professor Max Tegmark, Tegmark is one of the leading astrophysicists. And Tegmark's work is extraordinary. He wrote a book about 8 or 9 years ago called Our Mathematical Universe. And he presents the case that not only is the universe mathematical and informational in nature, but he isolates where that information is stored, how it is processed, and the implications for consciousness. And he also argues that he uses that. He has a wonderful thing called the quantum suicide experiment, where he proves using quantum mechanics that we are all immortal, that we all can only exist in our own version of the universe, and we collapse the wave function of that particular universe. And my cheating the ferryman hypothesis pulls that into near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, precognition, déjà vu. And I use that to explain the phenomenon that I genuinely believe, and I genuinely believe is I'm the only writer in the world doing this. I really am. There isn't anybody else doing this in the way I'm doing it. And it really makes sense, or it makes sense to me anyway.
Well, let's get into it then, because I was, it's funny you say like you've been doing it for a long time and maybe have gotten passed by in terms of attention or people until it's like, I don't know. I think it takes a level of popularity, like when the Matrix came out and then people talk about the simulation. It takes to get people kind of running with it. Then Elon Musk is out there going like, hey, we might be in the simulation. And it's like almost needs like to tap people on the head who are too busy with their own lives to go like, hey, look at this. In the academic world, I'm sure there's a strain of maybe political favor. I don't know, who knows what ideas get out there, who gets pushed, who gets, I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure it's quite not enjoyable. But can we get into more of your framework? I know I was going and listening to a lot, reading a lot, the Daemons, like how you see these things, what consciousness is, how it's filtering into our bodies, you know, and how we're getting some of these phenomenon that people usually put into different boxes and go, oh, that's a haunting, that's an alien from another planet. That's, you know, can you kind of put in what you believe is happening?
Yeah, that's to me, it's so important that we need a model of understanding that can incorporate and explain all phenomenon. And I believe that my cheating the ferryman hypothesis and my broader hypothesis at least gives a structure that can be explored in one way or another. Now, I very much take the approach of the great thinkers of the 19th century. For instance, I'm a huge fan of Henri Bergson, as an example. And going forward into the 1950s, the great Aldous Huxley in his book, The Doors of Perception. And all of these guys have always argued, and going back even into philosophy, people like Spinoza, you know, the idea that consciousness is prime, that consciousness is something that is everywhere. It is a field that we exist within, and our brains are rather like radio receivers. There's nothing original in that statement for what I'm saying. Many other people have said it for many, many years. But the idea is the brain somehow distills consciousness and then manifests that consciousness inside the brain. Now, what I'm suggesting is that what the brain does, effectively, we are confusing how the brain works. We have the neurological model of how the brain works, which is effectively how the neurons in the brain communicate. And they communicate by using chemicals and electromagnetic energy and everything. But the neurons are only 10% of the brain. The neurological model of the brain doesn't really work. In that there are a number of problems that neuroscientists have with how the brain works. And one of them is called the binding problem. Basically, the binding problem is how we have a feeling of simultaneity. The way in which we feel that when we see something, the sound works with it, even though light waves are traveling at 186,000 miles a second, sound waves at 800 feet or whatever they are per second. But if we see a car door slam in the distance, it happens all as if it's happening now. We also know from how the brain processes sight that there are issues and problems because different parts of the brain are processing sound, sight, haptic feedback, touch, and everything else. The argument here is that they all bind together and they don't know how this works. Now, if the brain works differently to neurologically, because the signaling, the electrochemical signaling is comparatively slow across the brain. It's at finite speed, whereas we feel that everything is happening now. The solution to the binding problem could be that the brain works non-locally, in the way I was saying about subatomic particles communicating instantaneously using quantum mechanics. There could be an argument that the brain itself communicates in the same way. The parts of the brain can instantaneously communicate. Now, I suspect that the answer to this mystery could be something called the astroglial network in the brain. These are the when Kajol and various other people did work on the brain and they started looking through a microscope at the brain, they saw these long, thin cells, which they called neurons. And all the cells at each end, the neurons have something called dendrites and a synaptic gap, and the next neuron, they don't actually touch. And this is where the chemical signals come across the synapses. But they noticed that the neurons were held in position by 10 times more cells. And these cells, they didn't know what they were there for. And they still don't really. They're called glial cells, and they're called glial cells from the Latin for glue. And the idea is that the only reason they could think why the brain is structured this way is that the glial cells holds the long, thin neurons in place. But recent discoveries have shown that the glial cells are far more active than we first believed. And they communicate in a very, very different way to each other. And that communication is virtually instantaneous. And there's something that they've recently discovered called the calcium wave, which sort of goes across the brain at super speed. So this suggests that the brain the gastroglial network is processing information from somewhere else. Now, I argue that somewhere else is being drawn up from the 0-point field, which is the quantum vacuum. Now, again, two guys, Stuart Hamerhoff and Roger Penrose. Roger Penrose recently won the Nobel Prize for Physics. Really clever cookie, mathematician based at Oxford or Cambridge. And Stuart Hamerhoff is an anesthesiologist based at the University of Arizona. And these two guys have come together and argued that the consciousness itself is drawn up and created holographically within structures within the brain, which are in the gastroglial network and in the neuronal network, called micro. My brain's gone.
Microtubules.
Microtubules. That's it. Thank you. When you get in your early 70s, your brain starts to go. You're not quite as effective as you used to be. So it's microtubules. And they're tiny structures of tubulin that effectively create the structure of the brain cells. But they've discovered that inside the microtubules, they work like mini holograms. And they fire single photons of light from either side and create interference patterns within them. So if you can imagine trillions of these microtubules all creating tiny, tiny bits of a hologram, then you pull all of them together, you realize that the brain is working holographically. It's a big hologram. Now, we know again with holograms that the part is part of the whole. Like if you smash up a holographic image, unlike a jigsaw puzzle, when you break a jigsaw puzzle apart, you'll get each part of the picture. Whereas with a hologram and a holographic image, each part of the hologram holds a denuded image of the full picture, which means that each part of the brain holds the whole brain in some way. Now, if external reality, as the researchers like my associates that are interested in the holographic universe, and I think, again, I'm the only writer that's suggesting this, that if you look at that, if the brain is working holographically, reality is actually a hologram processing a hologram, because the universe itself is a hologram and the brain is a hologram. Now, the information for this I believe is held, as I said, in the 0 point field. Now, again, many years ago, I wrote a book with Professor Irvin Laszlo, who's been nominated for the Nobel Prize on a number of occasions. And he approached me to write a book with me about this subject. And Laszlo has this thing he calls the Akashic field, which is quantum mechanically viable. And it's an information field. And it's like the hard drive that runs the universe. And within that hard drive, an information field, everything is already pre-programmed into it. So every experience you can have in your life pre-exists. Now, again, this is when, if you read Stephen Hawking's very last paper, he came up with something he called a top-down hypothesis of quantum mechanics. And he argued from the moment of the Big Bang, everything that ever can happen, can potentially happen, was already programmed in. And all we're doing is collapsing the wave function to create the reality to accommodate our actions. So in other words, we are living in an incredible computer program that contains everything. And within that computer program, we can reduce down an information field that creates our lives. So in other words, your life is similar to if you are playing a third-person computer game, particularly one in virtual reality, where literally, can you imagine the scenario that somebody could actually create a computer program creating all the outcomes of every decision you can make in your life and turn that into a computer game? Then you exist in a haptic feedback suit where all your movements are reproduced by an on-screen sprite that you're watching in virtual reality. You are then embodied into that mechanism, that sprite, and then your memories are washed clean. How would you know that you were living in a virtual reality VR version of your life? You couldn't. It would be impossible. You wouldn't be able to know. Except on occasions, because what happens is, I argue, that you don't just live this life once. You don't play this game just once. You play it hundreds, thousands of times, like Connors does in Groundhog Day. And in which case, if you have a Groundhog Life, and funnily enough, the Russian language edition of my first book was called Groundhog Life. The Russians twigged it and actually called it Groundhog Life. And also Danny Rubin, who wrote Groundhog Day, the movie, the scriptwriter, he gave copies of my first book to all his friends at Harvard. And he said, this guy's done the science of Groundhog Day. So imagine then that you're in this scenario, but you've done the game many, many times. If you do, there will be times when you will recognize the circumstances you are in, where you'll go, I've done this before, I've been here before. That's déjà vu. Or what I call, well, paraphrasing, because I always cite my sources, I'm paraphrasing. They're an associate of mine called Dr. Arthur Funkhauser. And Dr. Arthur Funkhauser, who's a quantum physicist and also a Jungian analyst, has come up with what he calls the dream theory of déjà vu. And he calls living your life again in this scenario déjà vécu, which is already lived rather than already seen. Now, that means then that there is part of you that probably knows and carries the memories of all the previous games you've had, the life games. That game person is your game player. It's the equivalent of the person watching the screen playing a computer game. Because remember, when you're watching a computer game and you play these games, you play it many times, whereas the on-screen sprite is created for each game and dies in each game in most games. But the consciousness playing the game carries the information forward to the next game and uses that information to negotiate the world on screen. And I believe this is what we do. I believe our game player I call the Daemon, and there's an entity I call the Eidolon, which is the consciousness that lives one life and dies and basically forgets what had happened in the previous life. But sometimes there is breakthrough with the information field, or deliberately the Daemon will feed the Eidolon with information to help it negotiate a danger or a problem. And I think this all happens in the final moments of your life.
So it would be accurate to say that the player who's playing the game, and it's funny because it just depends on the terminology, but like Rizwan and like you go through and it's like very similarities in terms of how you see this, who's playing the game and consciousness. And
it's interesting, by the way, just to jump in there, Rizvan doesn't actually know about my writing. I need to meet up with him in London in a few weeks' time just to explain to him.
Yeah. Because it's eerily similar in some of the ways. Like I'm sure, like you said, you're offering. I think when I go through your work, it's like a lot of other complexities.
But I wrote it in 1999. That's the difference.
Ah, okay. Yeah, because I'm trying to. You made a comment in another show, and you said that if we're basically open to it or perceptive enough, we can get some of that third player or the player feedback to us. To see, and this goes right into like probably psi phenomenon and people who can sense certain things. And I know a couple people who've had some interesting experiences where they've done deep meditation. I think maybe psychedelics. I don't know. I feel like the psychedelics is more of a, and you've heard stories where whatever entities interact with them go like, you shouldn't. Like, this is the shortcut you shouldn't be taking. Not all the cases, but some of those cases.
Which again, just to jump in here, the people that are doing that research are friends of mine. And that particular quotation was actually cited by me. Oh. People may use that, but I cited that in my book. And it's also a guy called Dr. Carl Smith and the research they're doing at Imperial College.
Okay, very cool then. It starts to overload my brain because like I grew up Catholic. You get stories of demonic possessions, hauntings, some great experiences that change people's lives, some things that are very negative, some things where they get haunted and like, you know, there's so much in there and so much that muddies the waters. Can you help parse this out? And I know it's like you could take hours talking about this, but kind of getting in touch with this player and then I don't know, is it always a good thing, or are people who take the shortcut and end up in kind of dangerous waters? What's your view on all that?
The concept over the years that I've developed, and funnily enough, I'm very fascinated by ancient Greek philosophy, and particularly the philosophy of the pre-Socratics. And I've argued long and hard that these guys were very much on the ball. That's why I have the concept of cheating the ferryman, because it's this reference to the idea of what the ancient Greeks believed happened when we die. And the ancient Greeks, the term Daemon and Eidolon are actually from ancient Greek. And they're from ancient Greek into Gnosticism. And the idea, and of course the Gnostics believe that this place is a creation of the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, the false creator, the god of the Old Testament that was smiting people here, there, and everywhere. And I sympathize with you because I'm from a Catholic background as well, so you get programmed by it. Yeah. Catholic Irish as well, probably similar to yourself. Yeah. So going back to it, so the idea is that we have two elements to us. The daemon itself is ambivalent to us. It will help you succeed to fulfill its ambitions. And I argue that you can have a kalos daemon or a kakor daemon, which effectively in Greek means a good daemon or a bad daemon. And it's immaterial. So your daemon could be playing with you. Your daemon might decide to place you in incredible situations just because it wants to find out what's going to happen. It might think one day, do you know what? I'd like him to be, and I know this sounds an awful analogy, but you know, I'd like him to witness or be in the Twin Towers on September the 11th, just so he can or she can appreciate what it was like, because the person will then die and then will be reborn again.
Let me interrupt you really fast, just make a point about something, because I've thought before, and when I've gone on weird things by myself, is like, if I were to pass away and there would be an afterlife or something where your consciousness survived and you could do or experience anything, you'd almost want to be at certain cataclysms just to see what they were like. And I know that maybe that's just a me thing, but I want to see when maybe the dinosaurs went, you know, like these weird events that are like so mammoth that you can't even, so I guess that curiosity might extend to this.
And this is quite important. And it's an important point. I'm going to go off on a slight tangent here, because what your point was saying about seeing the dinosaurs or seeing historical events, what I argue is that I mentioned that there's the Eidolon which lives one life. And I can do the science of that. to an extent. And I can do the science and the neurology, split brain operations, deep hypnotism, all these things, multiple personality or dissociative personality syndrome. These all are elements and prove that there is the daemon exists. But I then argue that above the daemon is something I call the uber daemon. And the uber daemon is effectively my equivalent of the Jungian collective unconscious. It's an intelligence that has access. So the Eidolon has access to memories of one life. The daemon has the access within the 0 point field, within the information field, of multiple lives that you've ever had, that you've experienced as Scott O'Hara. So uniquely all your lives, but you will always only ever be Scott, and you'll only ever be born in the year you were born. You may die at different times, but effectively, you probably will only ever be born the same year. All depends upon decisions made by your parents. But just hold that thought for a second. So the idea is then there is this uber daemon, which is the Jungian collective unconscious, which Jung argued we attune into. Now, that is literally the collective consciousness, a single entity, which is the collective consciousness of all humanity throughout time. So effectively, if you attune into your demonic consciousness or your uber demonic consciousness, and these are all levels of consciousness, if you are hypnotized to go into the consciousness of the uber daemon, which I believe you can be, this is how hypnotic regression works. This is how you can suddenly be a 17th century French peasant, because effectively you and the French peasant are entangled in the way I was using the model before in terms of quantum mechanics. And because I wrote a book a few years ago called The Labyrinth of Time, which I argue that time is a brain construct. Time is not what we think it is. And the uber daemon is the equivalent of the very famous Bill Hicks monologue, where he said, breaking news, young man on acid discovers that we are only one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. And matter is just energy walked down to walking speed. And this is the idea. It has been known for centuries. You look at most religions and you look into the teachings of those religions, particularly the esoteric teachings, from the Kabbalah to Sufism, to the Brahmins in India, to Taoism. All of these teach the same thing. It's what was called the perennial philosophy by Aldous Huxley. And the one thing they teach is we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. We call that consciousness God, for want of a better term. And what effectively, whatever you call God, is embodying itself into the simulation to experience everything. In effect, we are embodiments of a God that's forgotten he's God. And in other words, if you were going to live forever, that's terribly boring. So what do? You create a simulation, and then you live every life of every entity within that simulation, but you forget who you are. Many years ago, I wrote a biography of Philip K. Dick, the American science fiction writer. And Philip K. Dick he discussed this idea in a number of his books, including one of his books called The Divine Invasions, where a young guy called Manny is God embodied on Earth. So all the esoteric traditions teach this. Also, all the esoteric traditions are to find the God within. I'm approached all the time by people involved in the occult, and they say, "My God, you're doing the science of what we've believed for centuries." It's really uncanny, the amount it resonates. I had Sufis wanting me to give a talk in a monastery in northern Cyprus because they came to one of my talks and they said, "My God, you're doing our beliefs." And then not Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons. A group of Mormons came along one day and said, "Have you read the Book of Mormon?" Then Scientologists, and they turn around and they say, "We have a concept called the operating thetan. This is what you're talking about." So all of them, and I just find it amazing that people aren't going, "Oh, that Anthony Peake's written about this." Isn't that weird? So there's the collective unconscious, but I then believe above that is what I call is the Godemon. And the Godemon effectively is the information, the sentient information field that is everything.
So Godemon would be God, for lack of a better term.
Absolutely. It is precisely what the Kabbalists would call the Or Ein Sof. It's what the Vedantists call Brahman. It's what the Taoists call the Tao.
So what attributes would you give to that? Because I think Bernardo was very, like, it wasn't, like, what we view as intelligence on Earth doesn't apply to what that is, right? And so he said, give it enough time, if this thing always existed and it's experiencing life, it could develop attributes that we would more align with, but it doesn't need that. So when you look at that information layer, and it's obviously wanting to produce something to experience itself. So what do you how do you view that? Because God is a very, it means like certain things to people and the traditional sense of it. And
the thing is that, it's whether that God can ever become personal, and whether an entity of that vastness can ever, it's the God of Spinoza. It's, the idea, and I've contacted Bernardo on a number of occasions about my work, and he doesn't want to know. So, fine.
Oh.
It's sad, but it's the way it is. And again, 1999, mates, when did Bernardo's book come out? Let's not go there. So the idea is then that, that there is just something, this intelligence, this something that is the hard drive that everything runs upon. It's the everything, and as the Taoists, I recently wrote a short introduction to a friend of mine who's written a book on Taoism, and he approached me and he said, "Tony, can you write a section of my new book? Can you write something about it?" And I read this book on Taoism, and it's fantastic. It's fascinating, the similarities between the things I'm talking about and this guy that's writing his new book, and I'll tell you about him later if you're interested. But effectively, it seems that everything is sentient, everything is consciousness. And it's a concept that actually, again, Bernardo and I both contributed chapters to this book 15 years ago. And it's called Pandeism, an anthology. And Pandeism is the idea that everything is God. It's not panpsychism, which is everything is conscious. It's pandeism, that everything we perceive is God. We are God. Everything is God, and everything is just elements of that. Now, of course, this is just a philosophy, but philosophy is just a way of thinking about things and trying to understand the reality. And again, the Kanuji Mapson is the guy that wrote the book on pandeism, and I think you might find his work fascinating. And then we have people like Tom Campbell. And Tom Campbell is doing very similar work. And again, 15 years ago, Tom Campbell and I did a huge event online, and I'm still here going, hey guys. So it's just one of those things.
Yeah.
It is a fascinating, and the model works. This is the thing that I find astonishing, is my model of reality works on so many different levels. But then I come to the conclusion, well, it wouldn't it? Because if I'm collapsing the wave function of this reality, in effect, you are accommodating you and everybody else. Although why I'm not more famous, I don't know, because I would try to reduce and collapse that wave function. Or maybe my daemon doesn't want to. Maybe my daemon feels that that's not what Tony needs to do this time around. So maybe there's a reason for this.
But the way you feel as Anthony, that's not the daemon. There's no personality that filters down from that to you. Like when we think about this thing that's connected to us, is it all, I know it's all God, or consciousness, but
the daemon is you. That's the difference. The daemon is the real you. The daemon is the you that lives your life over and over again. All you are at the moment in this life is an Eidolon that just lives one life and has no remembrance, or has vague remembrance. But the daemon is the real you. The daemon is your game player. The daemon is your immortal self. For want of a better term, it's the soul. But I'd more use the terminology of the Zoroastrians. I think the Zoroastrians have a very interesting concept about the consciousness that carries through time, as does the Kashmiri Shavists. I think there's a term called the Urvan, I think. Indeed, I'm quite fascinated by this, because if you look at the anthropology of my model, and again, I do an awful lot of anthropology, and a lot of anthropologists are interested in my work at the moment, is that you look at the anthropology of the phenomenon. One of the most isolated communities on Earth were the Huna on Hawaii. You look at what the Huna believe. It's exactly what I'm putting forward now. exactly what I'm putting forward now. There is an ethnic group in Nigeria that have a concept called the Biongbi and the Tembi. The Tembi is the immortal you that's lived all your life and it guides you through life. And the Biongbi is the singular soul. This is universal. It is in the roots of every single religion. But I'm the first person to actually try to do the science of it. Now, again, a great book that was written many years ago that was hugely influential to me was Julian Jaynes' book, The Bicameral Mind. And Julian Jaynes applied a lot of the ideas I've developed about the idea of the human brain is bicameral. There are two personalities within the brain. Ian McGilchrist, a very famous neuroscientist, a few years ago, still after my book, The Daemon, by the way, wrote a book that is hugely popular now called The Master and His Emissary. If you read The Master and His Emissary and read my book, The Daemon, you'll go, oh, virtually the same book. So there really is something to this, you know, and what I'm wanting people to do, and this is why I do these talks, this is why I write my books. I want people to take my ideas and tear them apart. I want people to say, no, you're wrong. You've misinterpreted Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You don't understand how the many worlds interpretation works. You don't understand Kramer's top-down hypothesis of quantum mechanics. These are all things I draw into my model. You know, there are so many areas. David Bohm's work on the implicate and explicate orders are all in my books. You know, and again, there is lots of areas there, and I want people to read them. What I'm frustrated about is they're not. They're not. I mean, yes, there's nearly 200,000 copies have been sold of my books over the years. So there's a lot of people out there reading them, and a lot of people contact me from around the world all the time. But it's not breaking through to the zeitgeist, to the Weltgeist. It's not breaking through as I'd hoped it would do. I genuinely believe that people would take my work and go, bloody hell, that is really quite extraordinary. Mm-hmm. And friends of mine have said it's either because you are a crap writer and people can't understand what you're talking about, or it's total nonsense and people are just ignoring it. But the frustration thing is for me is that neither of that happens. It's just ignored. It's just completely ignored, as if I've never written this stuff. And all the time, every few weeks, somebody will contact me and say, somebody's nicked your ideas again. And it comes, you know, you get used to it and you go, oh, right. And they say, why aren't you doing something about it? And I say, well, what can I do? You know, ideas are not, you don't own ideas. What you only hope is that people will acknowledge that somebody had got there first.
Do you think it's a terminology and a framing thing to where people are like, oh, you know, what connects? You know, I think Rizwan and what was so popular, and he even admitted to me, he said, you know, it's just, I made it palpable to Silicon Valley. I turned, you know, because he's very Eastern, you know, it's like the same themes you're talking about, but he said I had to turn it into like, you know, tech verbiage so people would like accept it, because as soon as you invoke God or any kind of mythological anything like that, they go, oh, you know, it's just more woo-woo stuff that I can't.
Well,
what I appreciate about you is that you were basing everything in science and you actually were breaking down. I like that. And it was just like, oh, okay. So now, because you always hear materialism and then they kind of knock this stuff and they go, oh, it's just a bunch of like, you know, the brain, you know, consciousness beams down the head. But no, you're talking about quantum stuff that you don't hear a lot of places. So it is interesting that it's not picked up.
I think this is because I'm too much of a challenge. In other words, they can diss these new age wackos with their crazy ideas and their channeling and their crystals and everything. Somebody like me is different. Somebody like me is open to their ideas. And I know sufficiently. And I mean, when I talk about quantum mechanics, I'm not talking about new age quantum mechanics. I'm talking about the real deal. You know, I even try to understand the maths. You know, I've broken down Schrodinger's equation to understand the meaning of Schrodinger's equation, for example. Also, you know, I dig deeply into the neurochemical structures in the brain. And I mean, for instance, I'll give an example of this. Many years ago, again, this is how long I've been at it. It was probably 2007. I spoke to 300 people in New York on Madison Avenue at an event at the Roosevelt Hotel. And there were, I say, 300 people there. And I start talking, and this guy stands up in the audience and says, I'm going to challenge you now. He butted in, and he said, I want to challenge you now. I think you're a bullshitter. I don't think you really know what you know. What you're doing is you're speaking to a script. So he goes, I'm going to throw you off script now. And I said, oh, okay, fine. And he said, I want you now in front of this audience to explain Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So I did. And he looked at me and he looked really sheepish. And I said, well, was that right? And he said, yes. And I said, so I do know what I'm talking about. Can we meet afterwards? Because I want to talk to you. He ran away. He wasn't there. Then I've been invited to skeptics groups at universities on 5 occasions. Every time they invite me because they think they're going to have a little bit of fun. And then they back out. And they don't invite me anymore.
So they want the straw man.
They want the straw man. And I'm not a straw man. I'm somebody that literally, if somebody says, as I said before, if somebody says you've misunderstood this, you've understood orchestrated objective reduction, that's great. I've misunderstood it. I will revise my ideas. But they never do that. They just go, oh, okay, fine. And I think it's because I don't have a PhD. I've been offered PhD programs now 2 or 3 times on the basis of my work. I've been offered a PhD program on the basis of publication. I mean, I've written now 3 peer-reviewed academic papers. So it's not as if I'm not doing the academia. I am, and I interface with top academics. If you go onto my YouTube channel, you'll notice the number of people I've interviewed, world famous quantum physicists, astrophysicists, neurologists, neurobiologists. These guys are all interested in my work and the implications of it, but it just doesn't tend to break through. But I'd like to believe that I'm here to now, and because this is my last book, my 13th book will be my last book. I'm not writing anymore. My role now is to help other writers. And that's what I'm doing. I'm helping other writers get book contracts, helping their work, supporting them, because I feel that's what I need to do now, which is what I'm planning to do.
Well, good. I'm glad you're not getting dissuaded by it. I know it's probably frustrating. You know, it's everything. Everything's saturated. Like I do like film writing stuff, and it's just like everything's so saturated with information and ideas. The internet, and now with AI, it's just like to puncture through and try to get something heard is very difficult.
Well, this is the reason. This is the reason I wrote the biography of Philip K. Dick. I've also written a biography of J.B. Priestley, the British dramatist. And also in my writings, I reference popular culture. I mean, I love movies. I'm a huge music buff. I mean, I have 48,000 tracks on my player. I know my music. So I can reference music, I can reference films, I can reference poetry, I can reference novels, which I do. And again, if you go online, you'll see me. I do a wonderful interview with a friend of mine, Martin Higgins, on the future of the ontological movie, where we go through a whole series of movies that take what I call Itladian themes, that is, themes that are reflecting the ideas I put forwards in my books. And there's hundreds of them. Literally hundreds of movies that are using, and I argue this is because the ideas I'm putting forward now are within the zeitgeist. It's something that people instinctively know is right, but they don't know how to structure it. And that's what I'm trying to do, is to structure it.
If we could circle back to, I guess, because you were talking about the Daemon and kind of the hierarchy there, and then I guess circling back to the idea of being able to come into contact with this and the forms in which people do that. And in your mind, is that okay for everyone to try to do? I know there's meditation, there's psychedelics, and I guess maybe I kind of segue that into the negative stuff, the demonic possession, some of these weird things that happen. How do we explain, right, if this thing's neither good nor bad, but one might maybe want to see us in weird situations? Like, how is this all interworking? Because people will point to kind of extreme examples, right? There's some stuff that derails people's lives and ruins them, other things that saves people's lives. Is that just us, I guess, fighting it, or how does this all break down?
Okay, well, I think I intimated on this earlier on, and I think what is taking place here is that when we have bad things happen to us, and we all do, it's a learning experience. And sometimes bad things happen because the daemon is positioning us for some time in the future. And it needs us to go through this particular part of our lives to get us there. You know, the idea, you know, there's many paths up the mountain, but the view from the top is still the same. That's a lyric by Little River Band, by the way, if anybody wants to know that one. Great Australian band from the 1970s and 80s. So the idea is that, you know, we can take many paths. And again, making a literature reference here, there is a wonderful short story by Jorge Borges, the great Argentinian writer, called The Garden of the Forking Paths. And this is the basic principle of the idea that there are many paths you can take to get to the same place. And every time you'll have different experiences and different motivations. But sometimes you might have to go through something terrible. Now, I also argue that multiple personality, the way in which certain individuals are possessed, these kind of things. Again, in my first book, I have a whole section on dissociative personality syndrome and possession. And it seems to be, and it's what I call the egregorial. So there's so many models I have here and so many neologisms that, you know, throw at them. But I wrote a book called The Hidden Universe, and it was about encounters with non-human intelligences. And this is why the people in the UFO world are interested in me, why the people in the dimethyltryptamine world are interested in me, because I'm also doing this and pulling DMT, alien encounters in and everything, and also ghost encounters. And I argue that there is a feedback mechanism going on here, whereby at the higher levels of vibration states, which sounds new agey, which sounds awfully new agey, but that's not what I mean. But the idea is that there are intelligences that can use us to come through into this reality. And one of my great friends who recently died, Paul Eno, who used to do a big podcast in America, recently died. He's an ex-Catholic priest. He's a really interesting guy. He was training to be a Jesuit and he wanted to go ghost hunting. So he was running through the fields of New England chasing ghosts. And the Vatican obviously got hacked off with this and he ceased to be a priest. But really nice guy. And he was telling me about some of the entities he's witnessed. And he argues that they're created out of plasma. They actually use plasma to come through into this reality. And I pointed out to him and I said, this is interesting because if you read the Qur'an and they turn around that man was made of mud, the angels were made of light, and the jinn were made of smokeless fire. And if you look at the idea of smokeless fire, it's plasma. So I argue that what is taking place here, remember I said that we collapse the wave function. By our intentions, a subatomic particle can come into existence from a subatomic particle before it's observed or measured is effectively a statistical wave function. It's a mathematical wave function. And then when it is observed and measured, it becomes a point particle, which has a position in space and time. And we're doing this all the time. And collectively, all human beings are creating this, whatever it is that's outside of us. And we can't even go into perception science, which I also discuss. So the idea then is that if we can create and bring into existence physical reality, we can in some way, by our anticipation, bring in intelligences, tulpas, for want of a better term, to use the technical term for these entities. And I call them egregores. And I argue that they are all manifestations of our own collective subconscious. In other words, the Jungian Uber-Daemon, thoughts of the Uber-Daemon. And these beings can actually bring themselves into existence and can become independent of us. And I believe this is what the UFO phenomenon is all about. And this is why, again, I speak at Contact in the Desert, because I argue we're being too simplistic here. We don't have the alien idea that they come from outer space. They come from inner space. It's very much the Jacques Vallée viewpoint and various other writers on this subject. But I try to do the mechanistics of this. And I believe that they come through and then use us to become independent of us. And I have many cases from people who have written to me who have created tulpas, who have then become malevolent and dangerous. And you have to then get rid of them. Because, of course, again, occult magicians have been doing this for years. Dr. John Dee, in one of my books, I discussed John Dee creating what he called egregores, spirits that you could then manipulate. Aleister Crowley was creating entities, which AWAS is an example, where he was creating these entities using ritual, using the mind to ritually create beings. And again, I was invited to speak at the Servants of the Light, which is one of the world's biggest Western esoteric teaching group. And they had me speak at two of their events many years ago. And I was introduced by the top lady, a lady called Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki. And she introduced me and said, Anthony has done the science of our belief system. Anthony is doing the science. This again was in 2009. And so they train people to bring in these entities. So they can be and many of them are malevolent. They're dangerous. I argue, for instance, this is how we can explain DMT entities. DMT entities are created by the brain and created neurochemically, but they exist somewhere else. They exist in a place that is a sort of a multi-dimensional reality. And again, I know so many people who are researching DMT, taking DMT, and interestingly enough, another substance called 5-MeO-DMT. And I argue that when you take DMT, your Daemon fractionalizes and you open up this ability to see the wider world. But when you take 5-MeO-DMT, which as you probably know is the excretion of the Cenarian toad. So when a Cenarian toad is felt, it excretes this stuff, 5-MeO. And people I know who've taken 5-MeO tell me that when you do that, you rock it out and you bypass the Uber Daemon and you end up in the mind of the Godemon, where you suddenly lose all sense of who you are. Whereas you take DMT, you are aware of being an observer of what's happening around you. You still know that you're Scott O'Hara. Whereas when you take 5-MeO-DMT, you're everything.
Yeah, I have heard that. Like you have to take, well, it was put more crudely. You have to take enough to blast past, I guess, what they termed it human baggage that you would carry with you about being yourself and all that thing, and like ego death, and beyond that to where you merge back in with like the source is where you would go into that realm. And I just thought that was fascinating. So is it accurate to say when you're doing this stuff like DMT that it is, because I heard you talk about this, and I think people would get the wrong impression that when someone has an NDE, they release DMT, but it's not that the DMT itself is causing the hallucination as in it's all fake. It's opening up the doors to see.
Yeah.
Okay. So can you explain that a little bit? Because I think people might confuse
it's something that drives me crazy here. I call it the labeling theory of science. You know, when I talked about hallucinations earlier on and the idea that hallucinations are a mind-created thing, everything's mind-created. Every single perception we have is mind-created. The visual system, the visual cortex at the darkest part of the head models an external reality. Talk to anybody who researches perception studies and they will tell you this. What is out there is not what is really out there. It's what the brain is presenting to us because it's a simulation and we need to exist within it. We are trained to exist within this. So when you take DMT, it's like opening the doors of perception. Your perception field gets much, much wider. And when your perception field gets much, much wider, you perceive things that are outside of your visual system. I used the analogy once in one of my books, and I said, the electromagnetic spectrum, which we think is everything that there is, the visual world, the visual light world, is a particular size, whereas the electromagnetic spectrum from gamma rays to radio waves, imagine that was the Mississippi River. Okay, so the electromagnetic spectrum is the Mississippi River, starts in a small lake in Minnesota and comes out in the Gulf of Mexico. What you think is the visual world and the perceptual world is 1.5 inches, about 8 miles south of Hannibal, Missouri. And that to me works. That tells me that, we are being parochial in the way we think. I call it egotistical chauvinism, electromagnetic chauvinism. Bats see the world in a different way. Other creatures see the world in a different way. Bumblebees do not see red roses because red doesn't exist. Red is not out there. It's just a vibrational state of the electromagnetic spectrum of a certain wavelength that our brains take that vibration state and convert it into red. But there is no red. So therefore, when you start to realize that, you realize there is no in there is no out there. So suddenly, when these entities are manifesting or coming through, or when somebody has a DMT trip, that's what's happening. So yes, DMT may be the cause of the near-death experience. I argue that DMT, as Rick Strassman said, is in fact our reality modulator. It's DMT that creates this. And what happens is the DMT world, like, for instance, we know from my latest book, the work of Jimo Borjigin at the University of Michigan, we know that they've found DMT in the pineal gland of dead rats. Okay? This is a fact. DMT has been found in the brain. It's all over the body. It's in the sinus cerebral fluid, but it is also within the pineal gland. And then we get back then to Descartes, the idea of the pineal gland being the seat of the soul. This is important stuff. And the pieces to the jigsaw puzzle are all there. And in my writings, I do everything from DMT experiences to out-of-body experiences to precognitions, and I've got so much material. And it all works. It all makes sense.
So that's one way to access maybe these other realms. Do you recommend that anybody does this, or is it something that you should be very careful of because of what you can create? Cause I've to be honest with you, I've toyed with it a lot. I lost my dad in 2020, kind of rocked my world. They say you have to be in the right headspace and the right time in your life to really kind of glean anything insights from that. But I'm always afraid of what I'll see, what'll happen, so it's like it's a weird, I don't know. And I know some people are very much more liberal with it and will do it and don't fear it. How do you come down on all this?
It's up to the individual. I think in the final analysis, it's up to the individual. I mean, one of the major criticisms people give of me in my peer group is that I've never taken DMT. And I have not done so, even though I've been offered many, many times. And by the way, guys, it's illegal in many, many countries. I'm not advocating taking it at all. But effectively, they said in order to experience it, you need to take it. But I've never done so because I'd like other people to be the psychonauts that tell me what happens to them. Because I'm scared. Like yourself, I'm not sure what it would do with somebody with my kind of brain. I'm not sure how it would work. And I might create all kinds of weird things that I'd rather not go there. But effectively going back to communicating with your daemon, I've been working for many years on the idea of how one can do that. And there are various tools I've come across. I mean, there's a guy called Stephen Schachter. He wrote a book called The Divided Mind. And he has a way of using deep hypnotism to actually encounter what, for many, many years, Erickson, the famous hypnotist, had a term he called the hidden observer. And again, this is the power of my hypothesis. Hypnotists have known about the daemon for 300 years, because whenever you put people into deep hypnotic states, something else rises up. And Erickson called it the hidden observer. And the hidden observer is the you that watches all the time. It's the you that's aware of things at all times. And it's your daemon. I call it the daemon, they call it the hidden observer. But it's the same thing. And it's the hidden observer that manifests itself at death. It's your daemon that is the being of light, for example. Within near-death experiences, when people say they saw Jesus, when they say they saw Elvis Presley, it's the daemon. It's the daemon manifesting and manipulating the reality around you to ease you into death. And it's the DMT that's released that then manifests and allows the daemon to come through neurologically. And then the daemon is then responsible for giving you the panoramic life review to guide you through your life. Because I argue that we have panoramic life reviews when people describe near-death experiences, but these are people that come back. Nobody's ever actually died clinically and had brain dead and never come back. And there hasn't ever been anybody that's done that. Whatever people claim, they haven't. But if you are clinically dead and everything, or you're damn near dead and flatlined, people's brains still continue working. And when they do, they have near-death experiences, and they have time slows down. One of the moody traits, time slows down, and the panoramic life review. And they say that I saw my whole life flash before my eyes. And this, to me, is again evidence of my Cheating the Ferryman model. What if in a real death experience or an RDE, your life doesn't flash before your eyes? It's a literal second-by-second reliving of your life, as happened with David Ames, the Tom Cruise character in the movie Vanilla Sky. In the Vanilla Sky, this is exactly what happens to him. It's exactly the same as the sequence in Interstellar, where you have the central character looking back on the life of his daughter, seeing her life in the Tesseract sequence. This is again because people like Christopher Nolan and various other directors, they subliminally know this is how reality works. And I mean, for instance, at the end of Vanilla Sky, you have a panoramic life review. If you've got the video or you got the DVD, put it on and get it to the final sequence where Tom Cruise and Penelope Cruz are on the top of the building, and he runs past, he says to Penelope Cruz, "We will be together again when we're cats." I think it's a lovely line, that. Then he jumps off the building. And as he's falling, you hear the band Sigur Rós start playing. Beautiful music. But start freeze framing it. And as you freeze frame it, there's a series of images. And they're the images of the life of Cameron Crowe, the director. He's showing you a panoramic life review. This is how accurate my work is. This is how subliminally real it is.
So in your opinion, it's okay to dabble in meditation, try to maybe get some feedback in this experience, because you can go through life really shut off and just not want to see anything. And people tend to, shy away from that stuff because I think it's kind of like unscientific. So you would say that's okay. Obviously DMT drugs, that's something else, personal decisions. Near-death experience is what they're experiencing. That was a very interesting comment you made about or people, entities you come in contact with. So when people see loved ones, see family members, and I'm selfish when I say this because I want to see my dad again. I want to do all that kind of, see him, hug him again, talk to him again. Right, the traditional afterlife. But
Scott,
don't tell me just to make me feel good. But you don't believe that's the case.
No, Scott, you will meet him again and again and again. Not only will you meet him again and again and again, you'll meet him under different circumstances. You'll have the opportunity to say you're sorry for the things that hurt him, because when you die, you will go back and live your life again. Whereas if you have the standard idea, you die and you disappear forever, you'll never see him again. Or if you go to heaven, you're going to see him in this kind of cloudscape and you're going to be playing harps for all eternity. That doesn't work for me. What do you do for all eternity? Which is one of the points I make at the start of my book, Cheating the Ferryman. I believe it's far better to believe you will live your life again many times and you will interface with all the people you love as you, and you will see them as them, and you'll relive your childhood. But you can change that. You can decide, okay, but this time I'll say to my dad, let's go on holiday to Maine. And you'll go on a fishing trip to Maine because your daemon will guide you to do that. I genuinely believe that.
And I've had similar thoughts, trying to think how things would be and afterlives and how that works. And then the idea that everything just snuffs out and there's nothing. And of course, obviously from a human perspective, a selfish perspective, with my own subjective thoughts, of course I don't want that to happen. I mean, it could be a possibility, but it just, inside it doesn't feel right. When people go, oh, this is all there is and just randomness and this is how we got here and we're questioning the universe and we're having this conversation all because of just accidents and it doesn't mean anything. That seems very strange and doesn't feel intuitively correct.
So totally. The fact of the matter is, philosophically, why should something exist rather than nothing? Surely more simple thing would be nothing. And indeed, the most simple is usually the correct thing. So therefore, why did we evolve from amoeba? Amoeba are very successful single cellular animals. So why are we here? Why do we have consciousness? What is the point of consciousness? It doesn't really help. In fact, it causes us problems because we get attached to people and things. So clearly there's something far more to this. And it's hubris to turn around and say that we understand it. Every civilization thinks their science has understood everything. And so far, no civilizations have ever got it all right. And I'm not right. I'm just scratching the surface.
Thank you so much. Please let everybody know where they can find you, your books, and any other contact information that you want to give out to the public.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very, very active on Facebook, and I will respond to any points you make on Facebook. Just go in on Anthony Peake, you'll find me. I also have my own website, which is anthonypeake.com. Also, I have my own YouTube channel where a lot of the things I've talked about today, you will see interviews with research scientists on these subjects. So as I always say to people, don't take my word for it. Don't. I could be a complete charlatan. I could be a complete dreamer. Don't take my word for it. My books are available. You can just go to your local library and order them. You don't have to buy them. My books are available in Audible, Kindle, every single variation, and I read the books. I had to audition to read my own books on Audible, which is, again, a fascinating story. Check my work out. I'm also on Instagram as well. Just check it out. Just Google Anthony Peake. You'll find tons and tons of material out there. And then there's more and more evidence that I'm a complete and utter nut job. But at least in my world, my hypothesis is probably correct.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it again. Anytime in the future, if you want to come on and chat, you're more than welcome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely love to.
All right.
I'd love to. Thanks, Scott. We've still got so much to talk about.
Do you have a story you'd like to tell us? Veil Encounters is for personal experiences. First Responders is for on-duty cases. Privacy options are available. Forms are linked below. We know you guys have some stories, so check it out.